webinar. So please give it a round of applause for Rob.
Thank you. My name is Rob Allen. I'm an API consultant. I do API integrations. I do API development. I'm self-employed. If your company has problems related to APIs, then please feel free to reach out to me because I would love to get some extra work. 57% of organizations have suffered an API-related data breach in the past 2 years. Personally, I think that is underreported. Most people don't like to admit their mistakes. So that number represents anyone who is in the EU because they have got laws related to having to report this stuff, and some Americans who probably keep it quiet. API security is really, really important because it affects so many of us, and APIs tend to get overlooked in terms of the way we think about security of our entire web application, our web infrastructure, mainly because they're not as visible. So APIs themselves are direct access. So it's easier to expose more data maybe than you expect compared to, say, crafting your web pages. It's machine to machine. So it's faster. We don't have captchas. We don't have so much common sense validation on API endpoints. More importantly, there's much reduced visibility. People don't see API so much. People don't see failures there like they see on websites. So it's far easier to overlook it. You don't tend to put web analytics on your endpoints, for instance. Half the time at least. You're also likely to have way more API endpoints than you actually realize you have. So it's a fairly wide scope. Which brings us to the OWASP API Security project. This is intended to help us find and fix issues related to security in APIs. And what it does is that it was first published in 2019, it was revised in 2023, and it's community curated. So it's a list based on real world incidents and obviously security research, and it focuses specifically on API vulnerabilities. So we've got the OWASP top 10, we have the OWASP API top 10. They are ranked by exploitability, prevalence, and business impact, which means the order makes no sense whatsoever. It's not theoretical, these are real world stuff. So we're going to talk through them. I'm going to cover all 10 items in this 30-minute talk. So we're going to go through relatively quickly. I'm going to group them into 3 themes. We're going to look at identity, we'll look at access issues, we're going to look at business logic exploitation, and we're going to look at operational security. So let's start with who are you and what can you access? Authentication and authorization. I reckon these are the most important ones to worry about. Someone is allowed to do something that they are not supposed to do, or see something they are not supposed to see. So number 2 on the list, broken authentication. This is where I think we start. APIs that don't actually verify who you are. So what do I mean by that? I mean there's no token validation, or it's weak. Missing expirations in tokens. Credential stuffing attacks, which is a very posh way of saying brute force rainbow attacks. Just hitting the endpoint until you actually get a valid API key, something like that. Typical example, you have a JOT, so using JOT tokens, you issue the JOT, you get the JOT back, you don't actually verify that the public key that was used, the key that was used to sign that JOT was actually the right one. It's fairly common, scarily. So how do we prevent this? How do we prevent these sort of problems? Fairly obviously, we use established standards. Authentication is one of those areas where you do not invent your own thing. So we go back to the keynote where you're going to roll your own, or you're going to use something that already exists. The standards for authentication are what you use for APIs. Specifically, use OAuth 2. If you possibly can, use OAuth 2, it's wonderful. Implement proper token validation. It's a bit of a hassle, but get it done because it makes an awful lot of difference to the security and the point of using tokens in the first place. If you're using JOTs, they have expirations. Validate that expiration. Don't accept invalid or expired tokens. If you are using standard API keys with, I don't know, tokens, client ID and some sort of API key, allow the user to delete a key and recreate it. If they lose their API key, you've got a vulnerability again. So allow them to rotate their own keys. And obviously, rate limit to prevent brute force attacks. Next one, broken function level authorization. I should apologize for the names, they're really dry. It's a list and they're very, very dry names. It's written by researchers, you can tell at times. Users can access functionality that they shouldn't. So we're talking about function level here. What do we mean by function level? Function level in an API is usually the endpoint. Unless you're using something like JSON RPC, in which case we are literally talking about functions, or if you're using GraphQL, then we are talking about each query or each mutation in turn. But if you're talking sort of RESTful like HTTP type API, we're talking about the endpoint itself. Are we checking the authorization on that correctly? Are we allowing legitimate calls to an endpoint that the user shouldn't have access to? Are we using security through obscurity? We are, aren't we? Undocumented endpoints actually get found. Good example, you've got a /debug endpoint that a developer created to make their life a little bit easier. It ended up on production. Another good example is you've got an admin endpoint. Same thing, you don't actually check that the requester is an admin. So how do we prevent these ones? You start by denying by default. So anytime a new endpoint is created in your application, by definition, no one is allowed to access it. Build it that way round. It's really, really tempting to put on the permissions on top. But don't do that. Deny by default and then layer on who is allowed to see it. It's way easier to ensure you don't allow the wrong type of accounts, the wrong type of tokens access to this given data. It should be obvious, but as you check the roles and permissions that are actually coming in on the request, every single endpoint needs this check. If you have a centralized way to do it, that will make your life easier. Never ever rely on undocumentation. An undocumented endpoint is found every single time. Number one. This is the number one problem. So it's third on my list, number one on the OWASP list. Broken object level authorization. So users can access objects that belong to other users. So we had access in the endpoint. Now we're looking at what data can you see on that endpoint. Fairly obviously here, what we're talking about is we've got an endpoint, we're allowed to see the data on it, like, I don't know, my orders, and then I change the ID and I can see someone else's orders. Probably not what you want to happen. And this is number one, which means it happens so frequently. Got quite a lot of business impact, particularly this side of the Atlantic, where we now have GDPR issues, if we are not careful. We're now giving data from one person to another person. Not a good idea. So to prevent this one, proper authorization, user policies. Again, you build a system that works for the entire application and don't do it ad hoc. What tends to happen is people build ad hoc validation per endpoint, and that tends to be problematic in being consistent. A simple RBAC essentially is what we're looking at here. We check the user has access to this resource before we give it to them. Also check the operation. Just because they're allowed to retrieve from that endpoint doesn't mean they're allowed to put to that endpoint. The two are different. So a bit of an aside, consider using random or unpredictable IDs. that does prevent brute force, which can be super helpful in the general scheme of dealing with your API. It also prevents business intelligence attacks as well, where people start looking at the ID numbers to work out how your business is doing. Can't do that with a UUID. Broken object property level authorization. So this is number 3. So we've got the endpoint, we've allowed the user onto the endpoint, we're allowing them to see this resource. Are we allowing them to see all the data on this resource? So just because I've allowed to see this endpoint, am I allowed to see everything that this endpoint can give me? Sometimes this particular level of user can't see all the data or shouldn't be able to see all the data. Sometimes we might be showing a user some data, but we don't want them to be able to change that data. This is object property level. So the obvious example is you've got a user's profile, the user is allowed to read what their role is, but don't let them change their own role. Probably don't want that. Another obvious example is you might have a profile endpoint where you're allowing the user to see some data because it's going out to be published, but admins can see further information related to this particular user's business details that you might not want the rest of the system to see. It's particularly important if you've got PII type endpoints. Admin people, support people, owner type people might see more PII data than general users. That comes into object property level stuff. How do we prevent these ones? The key thing here is not to serialize your database row and stick it straight out into JSON. Fundamentally, the output of an API endpoint is its own view layer. If you think about your JSON output as a view layer, you can now start putting controls and logic into that view layer and start thinking about how to do it. Now, we don't call it a view layer when we talk about APIs, we call it a transformation layer. So put a transformation layer in so that you get the data, you transform it to the type that you want to send for that particular class of user. And again, you can systemize that, and hence you're more likely to get it right across all your endpoints. Again, deny by default. So you start from the assumption that the request to this endpoint returns nothing. And now we layer on which particular properties we allow to get this particular role or this particular user class to be able to see. Start from nothing, build up. So much easier not to accidentally leak stuff. So I say, really, really, really do not bind your database straight to your output. You will regret it sooner or later. So there are all the access and authorization points. Who can do what? So now let's look at how we can exploit how the API is actually working. Look at business logic, look at resource abuse, things like that. 3 items in this one. Number 4 on the list is unrestricted resource consumption. APIs are abused by using up too many resources. But what we're talking about here is expensive operations that are not throttled. We're using up too much power, using up too much compute time, things like that. Running out of memory is another classic one, particularly when you think of GraphQL, for instance. Denial of service attacks is what happens at this level. We are now preventing legitimate operations happening because the attacker is using all our resources. Obviously, example, we've got a list of widgets. We want these widgets to be available to our users. We're giving it as a paginated list because there are millions of them. And then the per page property is not actually validated. Hence, someone can request all 1 million. We go away churning for ages to generate this 1 million widget response, which is now really, really big that we are now going to JSON encode. Or if we're really unlucky, we're going to XML encode. How do we prevent this one? This is all legitimate work. We want people to be able to read our data or operate with our API. So rate limiting is where we start thinking about at this point, either per IP, per user token, per endpoint, whatever makes the most sense for your particular application. You start thinking about rate limiting. This is a good way to prevent abuse. Pagination, as I say, should be completely validated appropriately. Resource quotas are a good way of handling these sort of things as well, particularly if you're using GraphQL. That works quite well for trying to prevent someone doing too complex a query or something like that. Another way of handling it, depending on the type of API you're doing, is spending limits. That's quite a good way to prevent people overutilizing an API if you are charging in that sort of way. And timeout switches. So if a endpoint is taking too long, you should be killing that request. So unrestricted resource consumption. Unrestricted access to business flows. This is when the attacker is exploiting the flow between different API requests that are intended for legitimate business use. Some business flows are a little bit more sensitive than others. You need to be aware of how they operate and interoperate between each other. It's quite easy to look at each separate endpoint as it's one thing, and the operation and interactions between them can be abused or used in a way that maybe you didn't expect because you wrote the front-end website and the front-end website is calling them in the correct order. The attacker doesn't do that. Most obvious harm related to this is excessive access. So the result of that is that you get denial to real customers. And the obvious examples are inventory hoarding and ticket scalping. So ticket scalping is where you're releasing a whole load of tickets for a concert and the real users have to put the ticket into their basket, which is an API call, and then they get to purchase it, which is another API call. The attacker just goes straight through to the purchase. So they bypass the flow that the app has to do, hence they are quicker, hence they scalp all the tickets and sell them on eBay. Inventory hoarding is something like, imagine a hotel that allows you to book rooms that you can then cancel. So you come along, I will book 90% of your hotel for a week, all that lovely money coming in, and then right on the last day of cancellation, I cancel all of them. So now the hotel's got no bookings, and now they have to discount in order to get people to book the rooms because it's now really short notice. So the business has now lost some money that they wouldn't have lost otherwise. Legitimate business, that's legitimate use of the API. We've reserved rooms, we've then cancelled rooms. The attackers happen to have reserved all of our rooms. I'd rent that one. Device fingerprinting helps here. Behavioral analysis is the type of things you're looking for here. And obviously transaction limits. You probably don't want someone being able to book all the rooms in your hotel for the same dates in the same 10-minute window. That's probably a clue. So we can do things like that and look at how to prevent these sort of attacks. It's getting quite sophisticated at this point though. So you're probably going to be quite slow at implementing this. And it's got to be very business specific on whether it actually affects you and how it affects you. And it tends to occur because developers aren't aware of the business side of things. And the business people aren't really aware of how the API affects the way the business is working. So that it's that difference between the two where this falls down through the gap. Number 10 on the list is unsafe consumption of APIs. They do like the word unsafe in this section of the OWASP board. This is where your API trusts third-party APIs. You're paying for them, so obviously you trust them. Data from third-party APIs are about as trustworthy as any other user, i.e. not remotely trustworthy. Even Stripe, do not trust it. A number of things happen here. Once you have a third-party API that your application is talking to, you are now dependent on their vulnerabilities as well as your own vulnerabilities. Malicious data from them can end up in your system. It's really, really common to assume that people that you are paying to provide a service are actually competent and will keep up their side of the bargain. And hence they will probably keep their service running. And we don't account for the fact their service might be down. So the obvious example there is a synchronous API call that you make. So you receive this data, you need to know where it came from, you have a geolocation API third party that you're going to use, and they've gone wrong and take 30 seconds before they time out to tell you that they couldn't do the work for you. And you've sat there in a synchronous wait for 30 seconds. Try not to do that. I'm using this one as an example as I fixed it for a client 2 weeks ago. Oops. It happens. You lock our API, we've now got resources used up on our system that we didn't need to have in use, which slows everything down. So as you can imagine, we need to prevent this one, and the preventions are incredibly obvious. And of course you are all doing these already, aren't you? So you're validating all that external data. It is untrustworthy. You are validating it. If you're using Stripe, for instance, Stripe will give you the ability to validate that that payload came from Stripe. Because they hash it. There's a hash key. You can check the hash key. You are going to do that if you're going to accept that payload. Other payloads don't have that. They are just, no, the geolocation API doesn't have that sort of thing on it. So you need to do your own validation to check that data is not broken. Latitude and longitude. We know what the range of latitude and longitude is. We can validate that data. We would have validated it had we accepted it from a user. So we validate it because it came from a third-party API, even though we paid them for that data. We whitelist redirect URLs. This is one of those vulnerabilities where we're going to go and hit our third-party API, our geolocation API, and they've been broken into and hacked. And what they've done is the attacker on their end has put a redirect over to another malicious website. So I'm using Guzzle, which nicely follows any 302 it sees on the line, and I go hop, 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 and suddenly who knows where I am. Maybe you want to check that. Maybe you want to be sure that we know why we are doing a redirect when we think we're going to third-party APIs. And obviously, we implement timeouts or the circuit breaker pattern. If you've got any experience of microservices, then you will almost certainly know about the circuit breaker pattern. The circuit breaker pattern is a fantastic pattern for noticing that an API has gone out of sync or stopped working, and we stop trying to use it for a bit. So we make this call to the API, it fails after 10 seconds or whatever, then we don't bother for the next 20 minutes, and then we try again a little bit later. So we don't keep wasting our own resources while the other system is down, because we need to keep ourselves secure and ourselves active. So that's exploiting our intended functionality. So the last three are all about operational security gaps. This is configuration stuff, it's infrastructure vulnerabilities. We are running an API, we are running something on the web. It is no different from running a website in that respect. First one of these, number 8, is security misconfigurations. These obviously occur in all types of web hosting. They also occur with our APIs. We sometimes forget they exist there. Insecure defaults. We don't security harden. This should be very, very obvious, but service configs are not secure until you have made them secure. A number of services have default passwords on them. A number of services are open to the world by default. That used to be really common. We've started stopping that so much now, and we only actually bind open ports to the local adapters. But we need to check everything related to that. Now, if you've got a DevOps team or you've got operations teams and things like that, this is the sort of thing that they are doing. But it's surprising how much of that ends up coming back to the development team when you wonder maybe it should be somewhere else. People don't update their security as often as you would believe. People don't, or do, leave features enabled that are not necessary and are creating a wider attack surface. If you're doing a browser type API, so an API is consumed by a browser, cause headers are actually a good idea. Very, very helpful thing. Make sure they're configured actually as tightly as you can get away with. Another one that happens quite a lot is that error messages turn up in stack traces in production because we didn't configure production differently to staging to dev. So preventing this one. How do we prevent this one? Regular security, auditing and updates. Do you have policies, procedures, regular reminders for doing composer updates, or do you do them as an ad hoc? What about your NPM updates? What about the updates for the Docker container that you're building? When was the last time you checked you're on the latest Alpine? I don't know. Do you have a procedure for that? You probably deployed that Docker container into your Kubernetes system via a lovely CD system, but the build is probably happening and is not being checked as frequently as maybe it could be. Related to that, we audit what we're actually putting into those containers. Do we actually need all that stuff that we put in at the beginning before we separated it out into 4 separate containers? Maybe we should be looking at that, what features are available. And as I say, implement those cause headers. Super helpful. And blindingly, obviously, don't put stat traces into your production output. Improper inventory management is a very research committee phrase of saying you don't actually know what you've got deployed. You might think you do, but you probably don't. Do you have old APIs still running? No, you've sunsetted them. They're going to be deprecated. You've got the new shiny one now. V2 is out, but V1 is still there because customer number 3 is still using it from 2 years ago. Do you have shadow APIs, which is the posh name for undocumented? You haven't told anyone about them because we only use them internally. They're only for internal jobs. Are your non-production environments available to the internet? Intentionally or unintentionally? The most obvious one to say is the version 1 endpoint is still going. You've done the new one, it's got the better security on it, the old one is still there. Seemed like a good idea to keep it around. That customer made us a lot of money. So how do we prevent this lot? API inventories is the terminology for handling this, which is a fancy way of saying write it all down. Have an actual list of what you maintain and where it is. And the obvious way to do that is through a set of open API specs, because then you've got documentation that is reusable across a load of other stuff. API gateways are super helpful for this sort of thing as well, because they can automate half that work for you, because they will tell you that valid endpoints are being hit and responses are happening through them, and you can go, oh yeah, we forgot about that one. Now it leads to retiring your old versions with clear timelines. When you bring out the new version, set a timeline for stopping and taking away the old version. That's part of standard business processes around sunsetting your APIs. A surprising number of people don't have policies and procedures in place for that. Try not to put your staging environment onto the public wider network without any sort of security or access controls on it. Probably a good idea. Sometimes you want your staging environment on the public internet because you would like your third-party developers to be able to access it. Sometimes it's for internal use, in which case maybe put it inside a VPN. The most important thing there is that you have thought about it and made an intentional decision. And the final one, server-side request forgery. The name sounds a little bit familiar, doesn't it? Cross-site request forgery is the one we all know. Well, there's server-side request forgery. And this is all about taking an endpoint or a URL from a user and going to that URL and picking up data from it. The obvious example is avatars for user profiles. So you've got your user record, you allow the user to upload their own image, and you do that via, they can provide the URL. So they provide a lovely URL that you go and fetch the avatar from. And they can put whatever they like into that field. And if you're not careful, you now have server-side request forgery. Because your API fetches that remote resource, it's from user-supplied URL, and there's nothing to stop you hitting internal endpoints if you do that. And you can hit this one here, 80/80 metrics, and you can do timing attacks on how long it takes for the error response to come back to determine what the inside your network looks like. And that gives you some valuable information to start attacking that network. Preventing this is exactly the same as for third-party stuff. You validate and sanitize said URLs. You whitelist domains. You check media types if that's appropriate. This is another one where disabling HTTP redirection is a really, really good idea. You don't necessarily want to be jumping and hopping across different servers. And this again should be fairly obvious, but when you pick up that URL from that third-party service, don't just stick it straight out to the user. Maybe check it and then send it separately. Because it could have been plain text. Now, you thought you were getting an image, you've got some plain text and you've sent it straight out, and that could have been some actual security-related information you didn't want to send. That's it. That's all 10 points on the OWASP API Security Top 10. I grouped them into 3 things. There are 4 related to authentication and authorization failures. That is, we want to ensure that the right people access the right data on the right endpoints. There is business logic and resource abuse attacks, where we are using up too much data, we are having workflows that we don't expect to happen, and we are using unsafe consumption, i.e. using too much data. And then it's operation and security, misconfiguration, infrastructure type vulnerabilities that we've talked about as well. So security requires defense in depth. You need to test with the mindset of the attacker. Don't do it the way you think it's going to be used. That helps for an awful lot of testing, actually. Which is why testers who are separate from developers are so good at this stuff. And it's an ongoing thing. You just don't stop. It is always ongoing. So a few resources. I recommend reading the OWASP security page. API Security News, apisecurity.io, is really, really helpful for keeping up to date on this sort of stuff. Can be quite scary at times. Worth keeping in touch with what's going on and thinking about this stuff. Leave you with this. Securing APIs isn't optional. It's a frontline defense for protecting data integrity and maintaining digital trust. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob, for that. Myself, one of my colleagues at the front exchanged a couple of awkward knowing looks during that talk, which probably means we've got some work to do next week. We've had one question come in on the Slack. We've got a couple of minutes to answer those. So if anyone else has anything, please feel free to throw them in. But I'll ask Rob the one question we have so far, which I guess relies maybe on your sort of extensive consulting work. How many companies do you reckon have all 10 points covered or prevented in their applications?
You don't need an impact consultant for that. The answer is 0, isn't it? It's got to be really, really low. No, there are probably some that are really, really good at it, and they are probably specialist teams in relatively small companies. I have a theory that the bigger the company, the more likely there will be gaps in places. An awful lot of those basics, if you take something like a really big company, let's take someone like Google, right? They will have nailed a whole load of those infrastructure things. They don't screw up their infrastructure very often. Workflow mismanagements, now that's down to the product teams. How many product teams are there in Google, do you think? To the nearest 1,000. I don't know, there's going to be quite a lot. So the chances of them having a problem there, high. So yeah, not many people have everything, but pick the ones that matter to you most and fix those ones. And that's the access control and authorization ones, by the way. Don't leak data.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. Can we give another round of applause to Rob, please?